gotcha, gonna, wanna, 'cause. These commonly used words are categorized as a non-standard English usage called reductions. Reductions are a dialect of English or a language variety which has a certain set of rules, as cited in Kurtzman and Adams, page 347, that allows for a shorter utterance when two words are pronounced as one or a single word is pronounced in a reduced form, speeding up language in everyday conversation. Instead of saying the two words going to, speakers using reductions will say gonna, a reduced utterance of going to. Instead of saying because, speakers using reductions will shorten the word into the utterance 'cause. Some reductions may contain the use of schwa, which is an unstressed vowel sound transcribed as an upside-down E. The schwa sound appears in the reductions bout to, a reduced form of about to, or finna, a reduction of fixing to. The schwa sound is present in the unstressed syllables of bout to and finna.
As a group, we decided to conduct a study on reductions and how and when they are used. While discussing multiple non-standard English usages, our group felt the reductions were familiar to us and most commonly used in everyday speech. The overall goal of this study was to find out how often reductions were used by individuals in formal and informal settings. We wanted to know if certain individuals were more likely to use reductions than others. We also wanted to know whether individuals use reductions in informal settings versus formal settings, or if they use reductions equally in both settings.
According to Kurtzman and Adams, the standard variety tends to be the language of instruction in schools, the language of the wider community's media and governance, and often the language of upper middle and upper class speakers. Page 349. Standard language is the preferred language in the context of school.
Knowing this information, we decided to use students and teachers as our target subgroups for our survey. Most students and teachers spend an equal amount of time in and outside of the formal context of educational institutions. Most teachers are attentive to grammar and spoken language, especially within an English classroom. Students are constantly in context where formal language is most appropriate. With these thoughts, we decided on the following as hypotheses to our research. According to American dialects, young speakers will use the feature less as they become adults. This was found on page 227, which is why we believe that teachers use reductions less than students. According to American dialects, since the type of setting you're in, formal or informal, is like a social group, people want to be considered as part of a particular social group as opposed to other groups. And so they protect their identity with this group in a number of ways, including talking like other members of the group, which was found on page 33. This was our direct thinking behind the hypotheses we created. The method behind our study was to start by creating a survey to distribute and collect data from the members of our subgroups, which were teachers and students. Each group member was responsible for collecting data from 5 teachers and 5 students, making for a total of 10 individuals. 10 individuals per 5 group members would give us 50 participants to collect data on.
The type of survey we created was an online multiple-choice survey on SurveyMonkey.com. Using an online survey would allow us to collect data from students and teachers near and far in a fairly easy way. In order to complete the survey, each group member sent a link to teachers and students that they would use to access the survey we created. The survey we created had 9 questions for the participant to answer. Questions 1 through 3 pertain to the background information of the participant, including questions related to which subgroup he or she belonged to. Questions 1 through 3 were asked in order to draw a relation between gender, age, and/or subgroups to the use of reductions, if there was a relation at all. Questions 4 through 9 asked questions pertaining to the participant's feelings towards and usage of reductions. Question 4 contained a brief introduction about reductions, which included a short definition of reductions and examples of reductions used within sentences. The introductions and questions were as follows. Questions 4 through 9 were asked in order to determine how often reductions are used and in what context, that is, in informal or formal contexts. Reductions are used by teachers or students.
We used SurveyMonkey to obtain our survey results and had 23 teachers and 42 students answer our survey for a total of 65 people. Our 65 candidates were also asked to specify if their age fell between the ages of 18 and 35 or between 36 and 70. After briefly describing what exactly reductions are, we asked why people might use reductions. The three possible answers were laziness, to make pronunciation easier, or a habit formed as the result of someone's upbringing. After analyzing the results, it was clear that the majority of the candidates, approximately 60%, thought that people use reductions as a result of a habit formed through their upbringing. When asked how frequently they use reductions, 38% said they use them often, while 44% said they use them sometimes. When viewing the results based on the individual groups, 45% of those ranging from 18 to 35 said they use reductions more often than sometimes. 66% of the age group ranging from 36 to 70, and 52% of the teachers who answered said they use reductions only sometimes, not often. An interesting answer to this question was displayed by the students who tied in answering if they use reductions often or sometimes. The respondents were asked 3 separate questions about the language they might use based on a particular context. For example, with a friend, with a teacher, or with an employer. The majority of our candidates in every surveyed group picked the answer that was not a reduction. For example, in the question, which of the following sentences would you most likely use in a casual context with a friend? Approximately 63% said they would say, I could have went to the store, overusing the reduction coulda. The tricky part of this question is that although the word could've is not a reduction, it is still a shortened version of could have. When asked, under what circumstances is it appropriate to use reductions, 86% of the respondents said that reductions should only be used in an informal setting, which could be with a friend, family member, or in a casual setting like a party or bar. None of the respondents think that reductions can be used in formal settings, which could include school, work, a job interview, or educational setting. One of the options that could have been chosen was, it is never okay to use reductions, which a total of 3 people thought. Curiously enough, when viewing the individual results out of the 3 people, none of them said they were a teacher. This proposes an interesting question on why a teacher, an educated member of society, would think that it is never okay to use reductions.
When looking at our results, our hypotheses were wrong. Our first hypothesis stated that students will use reductions more frequently in formal settings in comparison to teachers' use of reductions in formal settings. Questions 7 through 9 asked participants to choose whether they would use standard English or reductions in formal settings. In question 7, which of the following sentences would you most likely use when speaking with a teacher, more students chose to use reductions than teachers, but not by much. 4.76% of students chose to use reductions compared to 4.35% of teachers who chose to use reductions in this formal setting. Although more students chose to use reductions, it wasn't by enough to strongly support our hypothesis that more students would use reductions in a formal setting in comparison to teachers. The possible reasoning behind why more teachers chose to use reductions versus students is because the setting presented is more of a formal setting for students rather than teachers. The question created would not necessarily be presented as a formal setting for teachers because speaking with a teacher might be the same as speaking with a friend for a teacher. When speaking with other teachers, a teacher might be amongst their same age peers or social group in this setting. In question 8, teachers chose to use reductions more frequently than students in the formal setting presented. Only 7.14% of students chose to use reductions compared to 17.39% of teachers who chose to use reductions in a formal setting. Question 9 proved all 3 of our hypotheses wrong. Hypotheses 2 and 3 stated that more students will use reductions in formal and informal settings in comparison to teachers, and teachers will use reductions less than students in both formal and informal settings. When answering question 9, students and teachers responded the same to the use of reductions in formal settings. 0% of students felt it was appropriate to use reductions in both informal and formal circumstances, and 26.09% of teachers felt it was appropriate to use reductions in both informal and formal settings, showing that more teachers will use reductions in informal and formal settings compared to students. 7.14% of students said it is never okay to use reductions compared to 0% of teachers, showing that more teachers feel that it is okay to use reductions compared to students. According to our results, 60% of the total participants surveyed felt that reductions were a result of habit formed through upbringing. If upbringing is the cause of the use of reductions, then age or social context may or may not be a factor of the use of reductions. Almost 82% of the participants surveyed were between the ages of 18 to 35 years old, and about 86% felt that reductions should only be used in formal settings. Only teachers thought that the use of reductions was allowed in both formal and informal settings. While age may be a factor in participant answers, being a student or teacher did not matter. People protect their identity within a social group by talking like the individuals in this group. If the individuals surveyed belong to the 18 to 35-year-old group, there is a large possibility that they will talk according to the members of their group and carry the same beliefs towards language as the group. This may be one reason why the majority of teachers and students had very close percentages about the use of reductions in their responses. If we look at the school setting as being a social group, then it would make sense for teachers and students, members within the school setting social group, to carry similar beliefs towards the use of reductions. According to Wikipedia and yourdictionary.com, a response bias is a type of cognitive bias which can affect the results of a statistical survey if respondents answer questions in the way they think the questionnaire wants them to answer rather than according to their true beliefs. This might be one reason why we got the results that we did. Less than 2% of participants surveyed never use reductions, leaving almost 90% of participants to use reductions in their speech. This shows us that non-standard English usage is common, and although individuals carry the knowledge that reductions are informal, they still use them. According to Kurtzon and Adams, standard English is not always preferable or appropriate variety for a social situation. Where you are and who you're speaking to is a better predictor for the use of reductions versus whether you are a teacher or a student.
After creating the survey and receiving many of the results, we realized that our survey had a few limitations. The first problem we encountered was that although we all contacted teachers and asked them to complete our survey, not as many were as willing to fill it out. We had an overwhelmingly large difference in students who answered versus the amount of teachers that answered. 1/3 were teachers. This limitation may have affected our results because the students had more leverage in the outcome. Another limitation could have been that the number of respondents between the ages of 18 to 35 was more than the respondents over the age of 36. Another limitation that I observed after viewing the results was that it's possible when people take surveys, they think that somehow the survey is a judgment of their character or personality, so they give the answer they think is right or what we might expect from them. I certainly think this of students because when I am taking a survey, I think about what answer I would want people to know that I answered. Instead of observing a student or teacher in a real-life context in which they answer honestly, we give them an opportunity to actually think about what they are saying rather than hearing their immediate answer. In the future, I would want to monitor the respondents to make sure that the number of students and teachers and those of different ages was even. If we had more time, I would survey the candidates differently. I may have even done a face-to-face survey and do an interactive aspect so that the answer to the questions based on various contexts might have been more accurate.